The first time I heard the pines breathe, I thought it was just the wind losing its way between the trunks. I told myself that. I clung to that simple explanation the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. But deep down, somewhere beneath the thud of my pulse and the rational mind I'd built my whole career on, I knew the truth was wrong. The forest wasn't caught in the wind. The forest was exhaling. My name's Cole, 43 years old. Not the hero type, but I've worn the uniform of a U.S. Forest Ranger long enough to pretend I understand the woods better than I do. I work in a region locals call Whisper Ridge, a jagged stretch of pine and granite tucked into the northern Rockies, far from the maps tourists carry. The kind of place you only end up in if you're lost, unlucky, or born within its reach. I wasn't born here. Maybe that's why the forest took such interest in me. Whisper Ridge is more like a living memory than a landscape. The pines rise in tight clusters, their trunks dark as river stones, their needles thick enough to swallow sound. Fog rests low most mornings, almost too low, as if choosing to hug the ground instead of drifting upward like fog naturally should. And at night, the sky feels closer. Too close. You can hear the cold settling in the branches like an old creature stretching its back. People come to the Rockies expecting grandeur, open sky, clean air, maybe a black bear rooting around a dumpster if they're lucky. But here, people expect something else. People expect stories. In town, they whisper them the way families whisper scandals. Quiet, shameful, but too true to ignore. Old miners who vanished in the 1890s. A hunter found with his rifle, snapped in half like a twig. The three hikers who staggered out of the timberline, barefoot and shaking, unable to explain why their compass needles spun in steady circles. If you stay long enough, the locals ask you a single question. So, have you heard it yet? I hadn't. For the first few years, I was the outsider ranger, more focused on wildfire reports and trail maintenance than campfire tales. I chalked the stories up to small-town boredom, amplified by whiskey and wind. But that changed the winter I took the Northern Patrol route alone. That's when I heard it. That's when everything shifted, from quiet unease into the kind of tension that grips you by the spine and squeezes. My first unusual call-out on Whisper Ridge happened during my 5th year on duty. The snow was early that season, draping the pines in a thick crust that deadened every footstep. I'd just finished repairing a broken footbridge when dispatch crackled through my radio. Cole, we got a report from an old cabin near the switchbacks. Woman says there's knocking on her door. Repeated. No vehicle tracks leading in. The switchbacks weren't close, and the only cabin out there belonged to an older widow named May, who had more courage in her than most of the town combined. If she was spooked, something was wrong. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was gone and the cold bit straight through my jacket. But the first thing I noticed wasn't the temperature. It was the silence. The forest felt poised, like it was waiting for me to speak first. I knocked gently. May, it's Cole. I'm coming in. She unlatched the door and practically dragged me inside. The fire behind her crackled low, too low for how long she must have been awake. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. It keeps knocking, she whispered. Always 3 times, always the same rhythm. Probably an animal, I said out of habit. Maybe a pine marten trying to get warm. She stared at me like I'd said something ridiculous. Animals don't knock, Cole, and they don't whisper after they do. Whisper? She pointed to the door. Put your ear to it. Now, I pride myself on being reasonable, on believing in the laws of nature, even out here where nature bends its own rules. But something in her voice, the exhaustion, the fear, made me step forward without a joke, without a smile. I pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing at first. Just the crackle of the fire behind me, the faint hiss of wind threading through the cabin roof. But then, a knock. 3 taps. Slow, deliberate. As if someone was testing the door with a bone, I froze. Another sound followed, so delicate, so thin it almost wasn't sound at all. A breath. Not wind. Not human. It was like a voice exhaling through needles. My throat tightened. Instinct screamed at me to open the door, to confront whatever waited outside, but something stronger held me back. a pressure in my chest, like the forest itself had placed a cold hand between my shoulder blades and whispered, "Don't." May grabbed my arm. "It only knocks when I'm alone," she said. "It stopped when you walked up. It knows you're here." That didn't help either of us feel better. I kept listening. The breath dragged along the seams of the doorframe, tasting the gap in the wood. Then it faded, swallowed by the hush of snow settling outside. I stepped back, pulse thudding so hard I felt it in my teeth. "May, pack some things. You're staying in town tonight." She didn't argue, but here's the part that lodged deep in my mind, the part that kept me awake long after she was safe. As I walked her to my truck, the snow unbroken around us, something moved in the tree line. Just a shadow. Maybe. Maybe not. But the silence swelled like a held breath, and for a moment I felt certain the forest was leaning in to listen. Nothing chased us, nothing ran, no figure followed, but the quiet had weight, and weight always means presence. I filed the report, of course. Possible animal disturbance. What else could I say? That the forest knocked politely before trying to come inside. That it whispered like something ancient inhaling through a throat full of pine needles? No. A ranger has rules. And the first rule is simple. If you can't explain it, you don't put it in writing. That night was the first time I felt genuine doubt. Doubt in the job, doubt in myself, doubt in the boundary between reality and whatever watches from the tree line. And once that doubt creeps in, the woods notice. They always notice. Because the pines don't whisper for the confident. They whisper for the uncertain. The ones who glance over their shoulder a second too long. The ones who start to listen to the spaces between the sounds. A month later, the second story found me. A story that didn't knock, didn't whisper. It watched. And I learned the hard way that fear doesn't burst into your life. It grows. It breathes. It waits for you to stop pretending you're not afraid. I didn't tell anyone about May's cabin, at least not the real version of it. But stories don't need to be spoken aloud to spread. Out here, fear has its own messenger system, its own way of traveling through bark and wind and rumor, and the forest listens to all of it. A week after the knocking incident, I took the Northern Patrol route again. The sky had the pale, brittle color of old bone, and the air tasted metallic like frozen iron. I remember thinking the world felt thinner that day, like one layer of reality had been scraped off during the night, leaving something raw and exposed beneath it. There's a stretch of trail called Crow's Loop that cuts through a ravine where the pines grow so close together, their branches claw at each other. The ravine floor stays shaded year-round, even in summer, but in winter it becomes a narrow, twilight world. Every sound echoes wrong. Your own footsteps feel like they belong to someone else. And that's where I found the prints. Huge prints, human-shaped, but wrong. The snow around them was untouched, pristine, except for that single line of steps leading into the thicker pines. No dragging, no staggering. Whatever made them walked with calm, deliberate weight, kneading the snow into deep, round impressions big enough to swallow my entire boot. I crouched beside the closest one, fingers hovering above the indentation. The heat leached from my gloves, and something in me resisted the idea of touching it. Not fear. Instinct. The same instinct animals have before a storm hits. I've seen bear tracks, elk tracks, wolf tracks. These weren't any of those. They were too long in the heel, too wide in the forefoot, with a slight inward turn that felt almost human. But no human alive has feet that size, not that shape, not that stride. I straightened slowly and followed the prints with my eyes. They ended at a cluster of pines so densely packed the shadows between them looked like a single unbroken sheet of black. And then, I swear on every badge I've ever worn, the shadows shifted. Not much. A slight ripple, like a body adjusting its weight behind a curtain. I froze. My throat tightened, and a surge of heat crawled up my spine, despite the cold tearing at my face. Something was watching me. I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see shape, just presence. Presence has its own gravity out here, its own pull. You don't need a silhouette or a growl, you just know when you're no longer alone. The trees were still, the air was still, but the feeling wasn't. It pressed against me like a hand on the back of my neck, heavy and cold, urging me not to step closer, not to call out, not to challenge whatever lingered on the other side of the dark. I forced a breath. "This is Ranger Cole," I said aloud, voice too sharp in the quiet. "If someone's out here, identify yourself." Not the right thing to say. My voice sounded small, weak, like prey noise. The shadows shifted again, smooth, deliberate, and then silence. No wind. No birds, no branches creaking, just silence thick enough to choke on. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes locked on that darkness as long as I could. Every instinct screamed to turn and run, but running is an invitation, a challenge, a dare. Whatever watched me didn't move. But the longer I stared, the more I felt my rational mind eroding, scraped away grain by grain. My chest tightened, and a nauseating certainty wormed its way into my thoughts. If I stepped 1 foot closer, I wouldn't come back. I didn't radio it in, didn't write it down, didn't breathe a word of it to anyone. Some experiences don't fit into incident reports. Some become part of the forest the second they happen. For days afterward, I felt that same presence trailing me. Not close enough to see, never close enough to confirm, but near. In a way that made my pulse flicker every time the wind moved wrong. I'd catch glimpses of motion between the trunks, a shift of white against dark, a shape too tall to be a deer, moving too smoothly to be a bear. And always, the prints returned. Sometimes only one, sometimes a few. Always fresh. Always on the edges of my patrol route, like breadcrumbs meant for a specific kind of hunger. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a hoax, maybe a trick of the snow. Maybe I was just tired, stretched thin, letting the unease from May's experience shadow my judgment. But denial only works when the evidence stays still. Evidence, however, is rarely cooperative in Whisper Ridge. 2 weeks later, the forest tested me again. If it happened at dusk, I was clearing fallen branches near the marsh flats when the temperature dropped so sharply my breath fogged in an instant. The air went still, the kind of stillness that means something big is holding its breath. Then I heard it, a sound that crawled under my skin and anchored there. A howl. Not a wolf's howl, not even close. Wolves rise and fall with a kind of desperate rhythm, hunger or dominance or warning. This sound didn't rise, didn't fall. It held one long, unbroken note, too deep and too sustained to be natural, a sound that vibrated through the pines, through the ground, and finally through my ribs, shaking something loose in me I didn't know I'd been holding together. My knees locked. Every nerve bristled. The howl stretched on, bending at the edges like metal groaning under weight. And then something even worse. As the howl faded, I heard breathing. Not mine, not an echo, breathing somewhere just beyond the tree line. Slow, heavy, measured. Each inhale dragged against the cold air, each exhale fogged into the dusk, visible for just a flicker before vanishing. I raised my flashlight slowly and pointed it toward the source. Nothing. Just trees. Just empty air. But the breathing didn't stop. It shifted, moving from one tree to the next, pacing, circling. My legs felt like they were sinking into the ground. I tried to call dispatch, but my radio only spat static. Thick, buzzing interference that somehow felt intentional, as if the forest had wrapped its roots around the signal. Then something stepped out, not fully, not even a silhouette, just a white shape, pale and broad, slipping behind one of the trunks. My throat closed. The flashlight trembled in my hand. The shape moved again, closer this time, drawing a long shadow across the snow. A massive arm? A shoulder? A torso? I couldn't tell. My eyes kept refusing the image, as if my brain was rejecting what it saw. And then, all at once, the breathing stopped. Not faded, stopped. The forest swallowed the sound so quickly it felt like the world blinked. I didn't move for almost a full minute, waiting for the next breath, the next step, the next sign that I wasn't imagining it. But nothing came. Only silence. Only cold. Only the forest's patient stare. I forced myself to walk, never running, never looking directly behind me, but feeling the weight of an unseen gaze follow every step until I reached my truck. Fear had grown roots inside me that night, the kind that twist, that pull, that whisper, you're no longer just a guardian of the forest, you're part of its story. and Whisper Ridge wasn't done telling mine. In the days that followed, I realized the forest had changed the way it moved around me. It wasn't the obvious kind of change, not the kind tourists would notice or even most rangers. It was subtle, calculated, like the woods were adjusting their posture, leaning in a little closer each time I stepped into them. The pines no longer swayed in the breeze the way I remembered. They shifted with a kind of purpose, as though each needle strained to angle toward me. Birds stopped singing when I approached, and even the insects quieted in my presence, like everything living was waiting to hear what the forest would say next. And the strangest part? I started listening without meaning to. Listening in moments when silence felt like a question hanging in the air. I told myself I was being paranoid, symptoms of fatigue, maybe. Night shifts, cold hikes, too much isolation, too many strange sounds echoing inside my skull. But deep down, in the part of myself I tried to ignore, I knew fatigue wasn't the source of my unease. The forest was watching me, and I wasn't sure it liked what it saw. One night, when the wind blew in from the north, I woke to a sound outside my cabin. I lived in a ranger outpost far from town, just a one-room building perched on a slope with a radio tower behind it that hummed whenever the air was dry. The sound outside wasn't the tower, wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching the frost in a measured rhythm. They didn't wander. They didn't hesitate. Whoever or whatever made them moved with intention, as if tracing the perimeter of the cabin. I lay still, barely breathing, listening to the footsteps make a full loop around my home. When they reached the front door, they stopped. Silence. Then a single exhale, deep, deliberate, fogging the small window near my bed. The glass blurred white, the frost smearing from the heat of breath that didn't belong to me. A tremor rippled through my chest. Not just fear, recognition, the presence from Crow's Loop, the shape behind the pines, the long, steady breathing from the marsh flats. It had found me. I reached slowly toward the flashlight near my pillow, gripping it tight. My pulse thrummed so violently I felt lightheaded. I told myself to move, to get up, to assert myself like any trained ranger would. But something stronger held me still, an old instinct I didn't know lived inside me. The instinct that says, do not challenge what you do not understand. Outside, the footsteps resumed, but they didn't wander off. They paced, back and forth, slow, deliberate, like something large was deciding whether to break the door or wait for me to open it. Minutes stretched, maybe hours. Time felt slippery, bending around my fear, refusing to behave. When the footsteps finally drifted away, fading into the trees with a weight that made the forest groan, I stayed awake until dawn, flashlight clutched in my palm, breath fogging the cold air inside the room. Sleep wasn't an option anymore, not with something that size stalking my cabin, not with something that confident in its own power. The next morning, I walked the perimeter to inspect the frost. My hands shook despite the sunlight pouring through the trees. The snow was marked, but not the way I expected. There were no footprints, none. Just long, smooth depressions where frost had melted into soft, pale patches, too large to be prints, too irregular to be drags, as if heat alone had shaped the ground. I touched one. The snow around it was warm, not lukewarm, warm. The kind of warmth a living body radiates long after it's gone. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my jacket, my breath puffed out in a sharp cloud. Warmth in fresh snow meant one thing. Whatever had stood there was not an illusion. It had weight. It had heat. It was alive, and it had been inches from my door. But the warmth wasn't the worst part, not even close. As I followed the melted patches toward the tree line, I noticed something carved into the bark of an aspen trunk. Not scratched in, not clawed, burned in, like the wood had blistered under a brand. A symbol, 2 vertical lines, one horizontal line crossing them. A simple, primitive mark. Almost like a doorway. The edges were blackened and smooth as if something impossibly hot had pressed against the tree, leaving its signature behind. I stared at it, my mouth dry, every hair on my arms rising. Rangers carve trail markers sometimes. Hunters leave signs. Hikers get bored and etch initials into trunks. But this symbol wasn't like any I'd seen. It felt older, intentional, significant in a way I couldn't understand. And standing there, staring at that burned-in doorway shape, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. A presence, not physical, not visible, tightening around me like the air itself was leaning in. Not threatening, not benevolent, just aware. It had marked the tree. Then it had marked me. I kept my distance from that area for days, but Whisper Ridge doesn't let you avoid what it wants you to face. Ranger calls kept pulling me deeper into the northern side of the forest. Reports of odd sightings, strange noises, hikers swearing they saw figures on ridgelines even when no one else was around. Every report sounded like an echo of what I'd already experienced. And then came the call I'd been dreading. A missing person, a teenage boy. Local kid, experienced hiker, grew up climbing the granite spines near the timberline. He'd been out on a photography assignment for school. His last known coordinates put him near Crow's Loop, the place where I'd seen the prints, the place where I'd felt watched. I volunteered immediately, not because I was brave, but because part of me feared what might happen if someone else stumbled onto what I'd seen. Searches are methodical. Grid sweeps, line calls, radio check-ins. But that day, nothing about the search felt methodical. The air carried a strange tang, like wet stone mixed with something metallic. And the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to swallow the sound of our voices. Our radios crackled, picking up interference even in open clearings. And then I saw it. A break in the snow, a patch of melted earth, wide, oval, familiar, warm. The same kind of heat mark I'd found outside my cabin. My chest tightened, my breathing turned thin and ragged, but I didn't call the others over. Something inside me, something instinctive, primal, told me this mark wasn't meant to be shared. It was meant for me. As I crouched beside it, the forest seemed to lean inward, branches arching overhead like ribs closing around a heart. The woods were waiting for something, waiting for me, waiting for what I would do next. And that was when the fear began to take shape, slowly, steadily, becoming something larger than footsteps or howls or melted snow. The fear became a question. What if whatever was out here wasn't just watching me? What if it was choosing me? I didn't tell the search team about the heat mark in the snow. Not yet. We were already stretched thin, nerves frayed by the terrain and the weight of a missing kid whose parents were waiting in town with hollow eyes. But the farther we searched, the more the forest felt like it was absorbing us, pulling us deeper into its lungs with each step. Afternoon lights slanted through the trees in fractured beams, slicing the ground into warm strips and cold shadows. And in those shadows, I kept seeing movement. Not outright figures, just fragments of pale shapes slipping behind trunks, vanishing when I turned too quickly. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse in my peripheral vision of something tall and white standing perfectly still. But when I blinked, it dissolved into the dark like breath into fog. It felt like the woods were showing me pieces, hints, like a story being revealed frame by frame, never fully in focus. I should have spoken up, should have called the team over, should have admitted something felt wrong. Instead, I pressed forward alone. I told myself it was because I didn't want to spook anyone, that I needed to keep a clear head. But the real reason was simpler and far harder to admit. I didn't want anyone else to see what I was seeing, because if they did, it would become real. Some truths are easier to carry in silence. We reached the ravine near Crow's Loop just before dusk. A hush fell over the search party, the kind of hush you don't choose, but slip into unconsciously. Even the crunch of our boots seemed too loud against the tension tightening the air. Then something changed. A smell hit us. Subtle at first, then stronger. Metallic, like rust or blood, mixed with a faint sweetness, like decaying pine needles. One of the volunteers gagged quietly. Another tightened his scarf over his mouth. I knew that smell. It was the same scent I'd noticed the night the thing had circled my cabin. The forest was leading us somewhere. We pressed on until the ravine narrowed into a natural choke point. The walls rose steep on either side, coated in ice that glinted a strange blue under the fading sun. The smell grew stronger, crawling into the back of my throat like a living thing. And then we found the boy's camera. Not the boy himself, just the camera. It sat half buried in the snow, lens cracked, strap frozen stiff. One of the volunteers reached for it, but I shook my head sharply. Don't. My voice came out harsher than I meant. Why not? He whispered. Because the snow around the camera was warm. Because whatever took the boy left this here on purpose. Because something inside me whispered that touching it would mean accepting a truth I wasn't ready for. We mark it and keep moving, I said. But the others hesitated. They knew what it meant when a camera turned up before the missing person did. I forced myself to kneel. The snow beneath me steamed faintly, as though a body had just been there. I brushed away a thin layer, careful not to disturb the camera, revealing a trail of melted depressions leading deeper into the ravine. The same shape, the same heat marks, always walking, always one step ahead. One of the volunteers whispered, "What the hell leaves prints like that?" I didn't answer, because the truth was beginning to take shape, slow, terrible shape, in the back of my mind. A shape tall enough to bend the pines, pale enough to blend with snow, heavy enough to melt through winter itself. A shape that had followed me, watched me, marked my cabin, carved symbols into the forest, and now it was marking this boy. The search lead called for us to regroup further up the ravine, but something tugged at me. Not physically, nothing touched me, but mentally, emotionally, instinctively. A pull low in my gut, a quiet beckoning. Look. I turned toward the cliff wall. At first glance, there was nothing. Just ice, rock, and a few stubborn branches jutting from crevices. But then the wind shifted, brushing away a thin layer of powder. Behind it, a doorway. Not a real doorway. Not something carved by hands. A fissure. Tall, narrow. A crack in the rock running from the frozen ground all the way up to a jutting ledge near the top. The opening was just wide enough for something to slip through sideways. The edges weren't straight like a cut. They were worn, smoothed by time, or by use. The mark on the aspen, 2 vertical lines, one crossing, a doorway. This was its symbol, its territory, its threshold. Cold rolled through me so deep I felt it in my teeth. One of the volunteers noticed me staring. Find something? Before I could answer, a sound rose from within the fissure. A sound like something massive shifting its weight in an enclosed space, a scrape, a drag, a low, resonant exhale that vibrated through the stone. Everyone heard it. The volunteers backed away. The search lead whispered a prayer through clenched teeth. I stepped forward. I didn't want to, but something inside me knew I had to. The boy, the prints, the warmth, the symbol. It all led here. I raised my flashlight and pointed it into the darkness. The beam didn't travel far. It caught particles of frost hanging in the air, tiny crystals swirling slowly, like breath. Then the frost drifted aside. For a split second, I saw something pale inside the crack. A shoulder, or a torso, or something shaped like those things, but impossibly large. The light bounced off fur, white, thick, matted with ice. And then, an eye. Just one. Reflective, amber, unmoving. Watching me with the stillness of something that has waited for centuries. My breath caught, my chest locked. The forest seemed to collapse inward, every branch straining to hear what would happen next. The eye blinked once, slow, deliberate, like a nod of acknowledgement. Then the shape shifted deeper into the darkness, swallowed by the cavern. The frost swirled shut behind it. The ravine fell silent. I staggered back, pulse thrumming so violently I tasted copper. Every instinct I possessed screamed me to run, to get the team out, to never come back to this place again. But the forest wasn't finished. Behind me, someone shouted, "We found tracks! Fresh ones!" I turned. The marks didn't belong to the creature. They belonged to the boy. Leading away from the fissure, fast, staggered, panicked, and they hadn't been there moments earlier. The creature had let him go. Or worse, it had led us here on purpose. My voice barely worked. Everyone, stay together, no one wanders, no one goes near that fissure. But deep inside, a darker realization unfurled like smoke. The boy wasn't the one the forest wanted. It was me. We followed the boy's tracks through the narrowing ravine. our boots crunching over frost while the trees above leaned inward like they were eavesdropping. The prints weren't clean. He had been struggling, stumbling. His heels dug deep into the snow where he must have slipped or tried to turn back. Everything about the scene radiated fear, but not the kind you get from being lost. This was the kind of fear born from being hunted. The volunteers whispered behind me, their breath shaking in short bursts. Some were crying silently, wiping their eyes with gloved hands. Others clutched their radios like lifelines, even though we all knew the signals were faltering. The forest had begun to distort sound, swallowing our calls, bending our echoes. We were past the point of pretending this was a normal search. The tracks eventually climbed the ravine wall, steering toward a slope where the pines grew crooked and thin. The snow there was disturbed, not by one person but many. Not fresh tracks, but old, crisscrossing patterns etched deep into the earth like a map carved by generations. Something about the tangle of paths made my skin crawl. They weren't random. They were purposeful, like trails circling a den. We moved on until the trees thinned near a granite shelf overlooking the valley. The wind was sharper there, slicing through our layers, carrying with it a sound I hadn't heard before. Soft, low, rhythmic, a thumping, like something enormous walking in the distance. Each step delayed, deliberate, as though it knew we were listening. A volunteer grabbed my sleeve. "Cole, do you hear that?" I nodded, pulse pounding. "Stay close, eyes up." The thumping grew louder, then stopped abruptly. The forest inhaled, everything froze, and in that breathless silence, a cry erupted. Not ahead of us, behind us. The boy. It was distant, muffled, like he was shouting through layers of snow or buried beneath fallen branches. The volunteers spun around, shouting into the trees, "Call out again, where are you?" "We're here." Nothing, only the wind answering. But I knew that cry. Desperation has a tone that cuts straight through your spine. It vibrates the bones. It's primal. It's not something you mistake or imagine. That sound had been real. "Cole," the search lead whispered. "We split up." "No." My voice cracked like a snapped branch. "We stay together." That cry wasn't a direction. It was a lure. I didn't have proof, didn't have logic, only instinct, a deep, heavy instinct that the boy's cry wasn't meant to guide us to him. It was meant to pull us off his trail. The lead swallowed hard. But if he isn't where that cry came from. The woods seemed to exhale in agreement. We pressed forward, following the actual tracks, the ones marked in the snow, not the ones echoing through the trees. The trail wound through a dense thicket, branches snagging our jackets like fingers trying to hold us back. My heartbeat was so loud it filled my ears. Something thick and ancient sat in the air, a pressure that made my thoughts feel slow. Then the tracks changed. They stopped running. They started walking. The boy's stride lengthened. His steps deepened, steadier, like the panic had suddenly drained out of him. He wasn't stumbling anymore. He was moving with calm, deliberate purpose. "He's walking," someone whispered. "Why would he be walking?" I didn't answer. I knew why. He wasn't alone. We reached a clearing ringed by tall pines. The tracks led straight to the center and ended. Just ended. No drag marks, no confusion, no return trail. As though the boy had stepped into the middle of the clearing and vanished into the air. One of the volunteers broke down, knees buckling. "This is wrong," he choked. "This is all wrong." Another pointed to the ground. Something was here. Look how the snow's melted." He was right. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden under a thin layer of frost, lay another heat mark. Bigger than before, wider, warmer, fresh. I crouched, breath fogging the air. The melted space wasn't round, it was elongated, oval, like a massive body had sat or knelt there, and beside it, carved into the dirt, the doorway symbol, burned deep, still smoldering. The volunteers recoiled, the search lead backed away, shaking her head. "We need to call this in. We need something, someone else, a whole team. This isn't what we're trained for." She wasn't wrong. Nothing in our manuals prepared us for this. No certification covered how to handle marks burned into frozen ground by something large enough to melt snow with its body heat. But calling for help felt useless. The forest had already decided who could enter and who could leave. Reinforcements wouldn't change that. I moved toward the symbol slowly, the way you'd approach a wounded animal, cautious, steady. My fingers hovered above the burned lines. They pulsed with residual heat like veins under skin. The air above them shimmered faintly, and then a flicker of movement, of presence, of sound. Not behind me, not in front of me, below me. A faint thump echoed through the ground, vibrating up my legs. Then another, a slow, heavy rhythm. The clearing itself was breathing, just once. A deep inhale. The volunteers screamed, stumbling back. The search lead shouted my name. Someone grabbed my arm, trying to pull me away, but I didn't move, because something was rising beneath the earth. Something massive. Something ancient. Something that had lived under Whisper Ridge long before the first Rangers stood watch. The ground trembled. Snow slid across the clearing, drifting toward the symbol as if being pulled. I staggered back as the earth beneath the burned marking cracked open, just an inch, then two. A sliver of darkness yawned beneath the frost. Cold air blasted out, colder than winter air should ever be. And riding that cold, a whisper. My name. Soft, low, echoing from below. The volunteers bolted. The search lead ran, dragging two people with her. Their footsteps crashed through the pines, fading fast. But I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move, because the voice that whispered my name wasn't unfamiliar. It was my voice. Not echoing, not warped, not imitated. Perfect. As if I were underground, whispering to myself. The crack sealed shut a second later, snow hissing as it fused. The melted patch cooled. The whisper vanished, the forest released its breath, and the clearing fell silent once more. I left with the others. The boy was found 3 hours later, alive but unconscious, near the trailhead, miles from where his tracks had ended. Hypothermic, trembling, unable to speak. He didn't remember the search, didn't remember wandering, didn't remember the ravine or the fissure, or anything after snapping a photo of the tree line. He did remember one thing, though. He remembered hearing someone call his name in the woods. My name. Cole. But he said it wasn't me calling him. He said the voice came from underground. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Because if something beneath Whisper Ridge knew my name, then everything that had happened so far was only the beginning. I wish I could say things calmed down after the boy was found. That the forest retreated, that the symbols stopped appearing, that the nights beyond my cabin softened back into the quiet I used to trust. But Whisper Ridge isn't generous like that. It doesn't give back what it takes. Not fear, not sleep, not the pieces of yourself you lose when the pines start whispering your name. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal shifts. Paperwork, trail checks, visitor education, the rituals of a ranger's life that had once grounded me. But even in daylight, something had changed. I felt watched, not occasionally, not uncertainly, but constantly. Every gust of wind through the branches felt like breath. Every crack of a twig sounded like a footstep pausing just behind me. The forest had become an adversary, a patient, deliberate adversary, and I had become something else. Not victim, not survivor, something in between. I kept telling myself I could handle it, that all I needed was rest, perspective, maybe a few days away. But walking away from Whisper Ridge wasn't simple. Rangers don't abandon their posts because the woods make them uneasy. Fear, after all, doesn't count as a legitimate reason for reassignment. But it wasn't just fear, it was connection. A connection I never asked for, a connection I didn't want. 3 nights after the boy was found, the knocking returned, not at May's cabin, at mine. 3 taps, slow, deliberate. The same rhythm, the same weight, but this time there was no whisper through the cracks, no breath against the wood, just silence. I sat rigid at my table, flashlight in hand, breath shallow, listening to the cold sieve through the seams of the structure. And then something brushed past the window, not a shadow, a shape too broad, too tall, too slow-moving to be human. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The shape paused just beyond the glass, a smear of pale mass, a presence that seemed to dim the room with its proximity alone. Then it leaned closer. The frost on the window wavered, melting in a wide oval as if pressed by something radiating heat, something living. I lifted the flashlight, hands trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. The shape didn't flinch. It breathed. The glass fogged outward, once like an enormous lung exhaling, and then a voice. Low, raspy, too deep to be human, but unmistakably speaking my name. Cole. I slammed backward off the chair, scrambling against the floor. The flashlight flickered wildly across the walls. The window froze over again in an instant, the heat gone, the presence receding into the pines without sound. I stayed on the floor for a long time, hours maybe, until dawn pried its way through the fog and painted the snow outside in washed-out gold. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was marked, not footprints. No, heat marks, wide, oval, still steaming faintly in the morning air, and on the nearest tree trunk, burned deep enough to char the bark, the doorway symbol. This time, not alone. Beneath it, another symbol had been added. An arc, curved upward, like a mouth, not smiling, not frowning, just open. The moment I saw that arc, something in me snapped. The fear that had been building, crawling, festering inside me for weeks finally cracked open and spilled into something sharper. Not bravery, not courage, a need to understand why this forest had chosen me, why it had followed me, why it spoke my name in my own voice, why it wanted something I couldn't see. I grabbed my gear, radio, axe, flashlight, map, rope, sidearm. None of it made me feel safer, but carrying nothing felt worse. There was only one place to go, back to the fissure, back to the doorway, back to the place where the ground itself had whispered to me. The hike took hours, though I hardly felt my legs. My mind worked in frantic circles, fear, denial, acceptance, fear again. The forest seemed to close around me the deeper I went. The light dimmed, though the canopy didn't thicken. The air chilled, though the sun still glowed faintly through the branches. I moved like someone pulled by a string. The fissure looked different when I reached it. Wider, darker, like the forest had stretched itself open to reveal the wound beneath. The snow around it had melted completely, exposing damp black soil that steamed in faint ghost-like wisps. The air smelled like iron and ice and something old enough to predate language. I stopped 10 feet from the opening. Why me? My voice sounded small. The fissure breathed. A cold exhale spilled out, carrying frost that crawled across the ground toward my boots. The doorway symbol burned on a stone beside the crack pulsed faintly, its edges shimmering. And then, from the dark, movement, slow, massive, graceful in a way something that size shouldn't be. A shape emerged just enough to be seen, a shoulder first, broad, fur thick as winter itself, then an arm, longer than any man's, ending in fingers too human to ignore, too claw-like to mistake. The creature's breath fogged the air between us, its head bowed slightly as if acknowledging me. Then the eye appeared, amber, unmoving, ancient. It didn't blink this time, it watched, waited. The ground under me trembled again, not violently but rhythmically, thump, thump. The forest's heartbeat, no, my heartbeat, matching its rhythm, matching its breath, matching its presence. Understanding struck me like a blade of cold. This thing wasn't hunting me. Not in the way I'd feared, it was calling me. And Whisper Ridge, the forest, the pines, the symbols, the melted snow, the voice under the earth, they were all part of the same truth. The creature wasn't an intruder. I was. I had been walking through its world pretending it belonged to me, pretending my badge meant something, pretending I was a guardian when I'd always been a trespasser. Cole, the creature whispered, not with its mouth, but through the earth itself. My legs buckled, my flashlight slipped from my hand, the beam skittered across the ground. The creature leaned forward, not aggressively, not threateningly, almost curiously, as if after all its watching, all its waiting, all its whispering, it finally wanted me to see. The truth wasn't that this forest was haunted. The truth was that it was inhabited, and every inhabitant has a purpose. The creature extended its arm. The hand, massive, pale, shaking with impossible strength, hovered inches from my shoulder. I expected cold, but the heat radiating from it was overwhelming, like a furnace trapped in fur. My breath hitched as my body instinctively leaned closer. Not fear now. Recognition. The forest had chosen me, not to harm, not to claim, but to witness, to remember, to carry its story, its warning, its legacy. The creature withdrew slowly, fading back into the darkness of the fissure. The doorway symbol burned brighter for a moment, then went dark. The ground sealed shut behind it. The forest exhaled, and Whisper Ridge went silent. I don't tell this story to frighten people. I tell it because there are places in this world that will outlive us. Places older than maps, older than memory, older than the first human who thought he understood the wild. Places that still whisper. Places that still choose. I haven't been back to the fissure since that night. I still wear the uniform, still walk the trails, still answer radio calls, but I walk differently now, slower, respectful, listening for the story beneath the wind, because I know the truth that locals whisper, the truth carried by the pines, the truth carved into the trees like a doorway into something older. Some forests don't just exist. They watch, they wait, they remember. And some spirits don't hide from the living. They walk among the pines, quiet as snowfall, tall as old legends, with eyes that echo your name long after you've gone home. Spirits the forest still whispers about. Spirits the locals still fear. Spirits that chose me and will choose again. The night the pines first whispered my name, I told myself it was only the wind, just another cold breath slipping between the needles, just another evening alone in the deep timber. But the truth is, I felt it long before I heard it. A tightening beneath the ribs, a pressure behind the eyes. The forest has its way of testing a ranger, of peeling back your layers until only the honest parts remain. And honesty isn't always comforting. It wasn't then, and it isn't now. As I look back on the stories that shaped my life here, my name's not important, not really. What matters is that I'm 47 years old and I've worked these woods, these miles of old-growth ponderosa and lodgepole pines for over 2 decades. The locals call this place Whisper Bend, not because the wind sounds strange, though it does, but because people around here swear the trees themselves carry memory. Not ghosts exactly, but remnants, echoes. The carved-out pieces of lives lived long before ours, drifting through the timber like pollen. My station sits halfway up a ridge that curves into the northern slope, far from the main highway and farther still from cell towers that work when you need them. I chose this life because I believed in solitude, believed in the quiet, believed that the forest, for all its strangeness and danger, was a place of truth. And maybe that belief blinded me. Maybe it made me too confident. People who love the woods don't like to admit when they're afraid of them. The locals, old-timers with smoke-stained fingers and memories like cracked riverbeds, told me their stories early on. They tell everybody new, not out of kindness, but out of obligation. People here believe the forest speaks differently to outsiders, like it wants to see whether you're strong enough to survive its attention. I didn't take them seriously when they first warned me about the missing hiker whose footprints stopped in the snow next to tracks twice the size of a man's, or the trapper who swore a shadow followed him for 3 nights straight, its steps never breaking the rhythm of his own, or the fisherman who found claw marks in the mud that didn't match any animal known to these hills. Every story pointed to the same fear, something massive, something ancient. Something that could move without sound despite its weight. Something that had never forgotten this was its territory before any of us had fences or job descriptions. Of course, I dismissed all of it the way a younger version of a ranger might. Logic first, folklore second. It was easy then. The stories were only stories. But then came that first winter. I remember the cold more than anything. How it crept into every crack of the cabin, how even my breath felt like it was trying to escape. Snow had dropped early that year, thick and heavy, the kind that muffles your thoughts along with your footsteps. I was 3 months into the job when I drew the overnight shift at North Ridge Station, a small one-room cabin with a wood stove and a radio that crackled like it was breathing. Nothing about the night felt unusual at first. I finished my rounds, checked the perimeter, made sure no campers had wandered too close to the ridge drop-off. By 9, the woods had settled into that deep kind of silence that only comes after a fresh snow, the world turning inward, soft and numb. Then the knocking began. It wasn't on the door. I could have handled that. It wasn't on the window either. It came from the back wall, the one facing the steep slope that dropped into 40 miles of unbroken forest. 3 knocks. Slow, even, hollow. I froze. I told myself it was nothing, maybe snow sliding off the eaves, maybe a branch shedding weight. But branches don't knock with rhythm, and no animal taps wood like that unless it wants you to hear it. I waited. The silence stretched. Then again. 3 knocks. I know people who say they don't scare easily. I used to be one of them. But fear gets into you differently when you can't identify the source. When something out there knows exactly where you are, and you know nothing about it in return. I forced myself to open the door, stepping out onto the snowpack, listening. The cold hit me like a slap. I circled the cabin with my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the drifts. No tracks, no fallen branches, no sign that anything had been near the wall. But the knocking had been real. I knew that deep in my bones. I went inside and locked the door without telling myself why. Later that night, I lay awake on the cot, the wood stove dimming to embers. Snowflakes drifted across the window, carried by a slow, patient wind. My breath fogged the air. I stared at the ceiling, willing my heart to settle. That's when I heard it, a sound I had no name for. A low, guttural exhale, like a bear's grumble, but longer, deeper, too controlled. An animal breath, but with intention behind it. It drifted from somewhere in the trees, close enough that it didn't need to be loud to reach me. The sound vibrated through the cabin walls, through the mattress, through the back of my skull. Something big was breathing out there. I sat up, every nerve screaming. The forest wasn't supposed to sound like that. Wind sighs, branches crack, owls call, but nothing exhales like a living furnace and stays hidden. The breath came again, drawn in sharply, as if whatever was out there was smelling the air, tasting it, tasting me. I grabbed the rifle by instinct, though I wasn't sure it would have helped. I tried the radio, but all I got was static, crackling like distant ice breaking. Then the breathing stopped, just stopped. And the forest went dead silent in a way I'd never heard before or since. Every living thing seemed to hold still, even the trees, even the air. That was the first time I felt the forest watching me. Not listening, watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Each hour dragged like a weight. Dawn finally came in a slow wash of blue, and with it came a shift in the air. Lighter, almost forgiving. I stepped outside, scanning the ground again. Still no tracks. But halfway down the slope I saw it. A single pine, its bark clawed away in long, deep gouges, fresh, raw, sap still freezing along the edges. The marks were too wide for a cougar, too deep for a black bear, too high off the ground for anything I could explain. I reported it, took pictures, logged the incident. The supervisor told me snowfall can distort claw marks. He said the knocking was probably thermal contraction in the logs. He said the strange breathing could have been a bear with an obstructed nasal passage or a bull elk in the rut. He said everything except the one thing that mattered. I wasn't mistaken. People can reason away anything when they don't want to confront the truth. But that wasn't the last time it happened. And as the years went on, the forest revealed more. Sounds, shapes, moments that settled under my skin like splinters. I learned to manage the fear, learned to move quietly, learned to trust my instincts again, even when I'd spent years burying them beneath policy and procedure. But nothing prepared me for the stories that followed. The pines held their secrets, and they weren't done whispering. Not to me. Not yet. That's what I felt the forest saying every time I tried to convince myself the worst was behind me. Not yet. Like the timber had a patience older than anything human, older than any story I'd heard from locals nursing beers at the edge of closing hour. And for a long time, I pretended that patience didn't apply to me. If the first winter taught me anything, it was that the forest never shows you everything all at once. It feeds you the truth slowly, in small and deliberate doses, like it's waiting for you to break open from the inside. And that's exactly what happened during my 3rd year, when I learned to stop trusting my eyes first. It started with footprints. It always does, one way or another. Tracks tell stories the way voices do, except the forest ground doesn't lie, not like people can. The memory is printed there until rain or snow decides it's had enough. I had been patrolling a region the map labeled the Narrows, a long corridor of tightly packed pines where the light felt thinner, stretched like it was swallowing its own tail. The Narrows earned their name because the ridgeline squeezes the forest into a funnel, creating a natural choke point for elk, deer, predators, and sometimes people who don't realize how quickly sound can vanish there. And that's the strange part about the place. Sound doesn't echo. It dissolves. That morning, I found a trail of boot prints weaving off the main path. At first glance, I figured they belonged to a lost hunter or a group of hikers who'd wandered from the trail. But the stride pattern didn't match either. Whoever made them walked in a straight line, each print deeply set, spaced evenly. Not running, not stumbling, just moving forward with unsettling purpose. But it wasn't the human tracks that made me stop, it was the others. Beside the boots, in a staggered rhythm, were impressions, massive ones, twice the width of my hand and longer than my forearm. Not prints made by hooves, not paws. Something else, something with weight distributed differently, as if the steps landed on pads but with defined pressure points at the front. Like toes, heavy ones, but no claw marks. Even predators leave claws in snow that deep. I crouched down, brushing away a thin veil of frost to study the edges. The prints were clean, unmistakable. The same kind I'd hoped I'd imagined that first winter, even though I knew I hadn't. And it became very clear that whoever those boot prints belonged to, they weren't alone out there. I should have radioed it in, but I didn't. Not right away. Part of it was stubbornness. The old kind that rangers carry like a badge they didn't earn but believe they did. Part of it was the quiet, unpleasant whisper in the back of my mind telling me what I didn't want to admit. If I call it in, I make it real. I followed the tracks. The prints led deeper into the Narrows, where sunlight drips through the branches in thin, trembling strands that don't look strong enough to hold themselves up. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air had that strange, metallic scent that only shows up when something big is close. Bear, elk, or something else entirely. About 40 minutes in, the tracks suddenly stopped. Not faded, not buried. They simply ceased, mid-step. The boot prints ended at the base of a massive pine. The larger tracks ended behind it. But there was no sign of movement beyond that point. No broken branches, no displaced snow, no drag marks, as if the forest swallowed both sets whole. That's when I heard the whistle. Not a bird call, not wind, a whistle, human, somewhere ahead, so faint it barely skimmed the surface of sound. It was steady at first, a simple two-note pattern, familiar almost, the kind a person uses when they're nervous and trying to pretend they're not. I called out. No answer. The whistle stopped. Silence tightened around me, the way it does right before a storm breaks open. I felt the first edge of real dread then. Sharp, thin, cutting close to the bone. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and that's when the smell hit me. Rot. Old rot. Damp, heavy, clinging to the back of the throat, like a carcass left too long under snowmelt. My eyes watered. There wasn't any decay in sight, nothing to explain it. But the scent moved, like it had breath, like it drifted close, retreated, then came back with intention. That smell meant one thing in the wild, predator nearby. Every instinct told me to leave. Every training manual said the same. But instincts are strange in the Narrows. They don't always feel like your own. Sometimes they feel borrowed, or worse, redirected. I took one step backward. A crack sounded behind me. Sharp, deliberate. Not the break of a fallen branch, but the sound of weight applied with purpose. I turned, slow as melting ice. There was nothing there. No movement, no shape. Just pines stretching up like spines on a giant creature's back, their needles trembling faintly, though there was no wind. Then the whistle returned, this time from behind me. I spun, heart hammering hard enough to echo in my ears. Again, nothing. That did it. I lifted the radio to call it in, but before I could speak, a voice broke through the static, or maybe through the space behind me. I honestly couldn't tell. Not a whisper, not a shout. Just my name, spoken in a low, almost conversational tone. And the worst part wasn't that I recognized the voice. It was that I didn't recognize it at all. I turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the direction it came from, but the voice didn't repeat. It didn't need to. The forest had already made its point. I was being watched, and I wasn't the one choosing the pace anymore. That was when the temperature changed. Fast. The air dropped from cold to brutal in seconds, sharp, biting frost crawling up my arms, even under the jacket. My breath shot into the air in thick, violent plumes. It shouldn't have been possible. Not with the sun still visible. The forest was breathing around me, shifting its temperature like a living thing. I backed away, step by step, slow, careful. The scent of rot faded as quickly as it had arrived. The temperature climbed. The silence loosened, but something followed me. Not footsteps, not breather, a presence, like a shadow pressed inside my ribs. The closest I can describe it is weight, not on my shoulders, not on my back, but inside me, pushing outward. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. Whatever was there didn't want to be seen. The forest was enforcing that boundary. And when the forest decides you're not meant to see something, you listen. By the time I made it out of the Narrows and back to the main trail, my knees felt weak and my hands burned from how tightly I'd been gripping them into fists. I filed a report stating that I'd possibly encountered of a large predator and that a hiker may have been lost. That was it. Nothing else. I didn't mention the prints that shouldn't exist. I didn't mention the vanishings. I didn't mention the voice saying my name. The supervisor thanked me, said I did good work. But that night, as I sat alone in my cabin, the silence pressing tight against the windows, I realized something unsettling. The forest hadn't been warning me. It had been introducing itself, and introductions never come without the expectation of what's next. What came next felt less like a chapter in my life and more like the forest testing the boundaries of what I was willing to accept. After the Narrows incident, I tried to convince myself that I'd misheard the voice, misread the prints, misinterpreted the silence. Humans have a talent for rationalizing what doesn't fit into the frame of the world we believe in. And I had spent my entire career clinging to the frame, reinforcing it, teaching others how to stay inside it. But the forest had already cracked something open in me, and within a few months, it widened the split. It began with a call from dispatch around dusk, one of those winter evenings where the light fades too fast, leaving the world dim before you're ready for it. A camper at Elk Valley reported seeing strange lights between the trees. Not fire, not lanterns, not car headlights. Moving lights, the caller said, like someone walking, but not right. I was closest, so the call fell to me. The drive took about 20 minutes, the road crunching under the frozen gravel. The forest on either side seemed restless in a way I couldn't name. The pines shivered, though the air was still. My headlights cut across the trunks like thin blades, and every time I glanced at the mirror, I half expected to see someone sitting in the back seat. Elk Valley has always had an odd feeling to it. Too open, too quiet, a wide bowl of land surrounded by densely packed pines, with a clearing at the center that never seems to grow anything more than frost-bitten grass. Locals say the soil there is wrong. They don't explain, just say it like that, as if the phrase alone is enough. I pulled up beside the lone tent pitched near the tree line. The camper, a man in his 30s with shaking hands, met me before I'd even stepped fully out of the truck. He kept glancing over his shoulder, like he expected something to crawl out of the darkness behind him. I asked where he'd seen the lights. He pointed toward a stretch of trees near the valley's far edge. They were low to the ground, he said. Not bright, but they moved, drifted, then gone. Maybe other campers? I offered. He shook his head too fast. No one else is here. and it didn't look like a flashlight beam. It was closer to the ground, and it flickered, but not like fire. I told him to stay put while I checked it out. I should have brought him with me, but I didn't want anyone near me while I investigated. Some part of me, quiet, primal, didn't want him to hear what I might hear, didn't want him to see what I might see. The snow crunched softly beneath my boots as I crossed the open bowl, harder beneath each step carrying a louder echo than it should have. The air had that odd vacancy to it, a hollowness, like sound didn't want to exist there. About halfway across the clearing, I heard something, a faint hum, a vibration more than a noise, like a string being plucked at a distance. The sound rose and dipped with strange precision. Not natural, too controlled. I slowed my pace. The closer I drew to the forest edge, the colder the air became. Not a normal shift. This cold moved in a line, sharp, defined. When I crossed it, I felt it cut across my face like a blade. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees. And that's when I saw them. Lights. Small. Pale. Drifting between the trunks like fireflies with no warmth. But these didn't move randomly. They moved with intention. Slow arcs through the air, rising and falling as though on invisible strings. Each light glowed faintly with a bluish tint, pulsing like a heartbeat. I stepped closer, breath freezing in the air. The lights twitched in response, all at once, as if they sensed me. Then they vanished. Not faded. Vanished, instantly, completely, leaving only darkness. I stood still, the silence thick as packed snow. Then behind me something breathed. Not the long, deep exhale from my first winter, not the growling rumble of a predator. This was short, sharp, deliberate, drawn in quickly through teeth. I didn't turn around. My instincts screamed not to. The flashlight trembled in my grip. I forced myself to speak. "Is someone there?" The breath answered with a second, closer inhale, right behind my left shoulder. My throat tightened, every part of me urged movement, but I knew the rules of the wild. Predators respond to sudden motion. So I stayed still, perfectly still. Then a whisper slid into the air. Soft, close. It said one word, "Stay." Not a command, a plea. The voice wasn't human, not fully, not animal either. It had a layered quality, like two tones trying to speak at once. One low and heavy, the other light and drifting. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I took one careful step forward, away from the voice. The pine needles rustled behind me, though there was no wind. Another whisper, barely audible, threaded between the branches. "Stay with us." I moved faster. Not running, but not slow either. Each step felt like ripping myself out of a web. When I reached the clearing center, the air warmed again, the darkness lost its density, and the breath behind me dissolved. When I finally looked back, nothing moved in the trees. The lights didn't return. The humming sound was gone, but the silence felt wrong, stretched too thin. Back at the tent, the camper looked at my face and immediately started packing. I didn't tell him what I heard. Didn't tell him about the lights. Didn't tell him anything except that it was safer if he left the valley by morning. He didn't argue. As I watched him zip the last of his gear, I caught a scent drifting on the air. Faint. Bitter. Familiar. The same rot from the Narrows, just a trace of it. Just enough to let me know the forest was paying attention. It took weeks for the valley to feel normal again, if it ever truly did. I patrolled the area often, sometimes by choice, sometimes because a part of me needed to face what happened, needed to prove I wasn't living in the shadow of fear. But something had shifted in Elk Valley after that night. The air never felt quite right. The soil seemed colder. Animals avoided the clearing, and sometimes just before dawn, I'd hear a hum far off in the trees. Soft. Measured. Like a memory echoing long after it should have died. I told myself it was just wind moving through narrow trunks. Told myself it was nothing dangerous. Told myself a lot of things, really. But denial doesn't last long in a place like this, especially when the forest decides to show you something worse. The lights were only the beginning. The whispers were only the beginning. The real story, the one that carved its mark deepest into me, came later in the old cave system beneath Deadwater Ridge. A place the locals warned me about long before I ever set foot near it, a place that didn't want to be found, a place that held secrets the forest had buried for decades, maybe centuries. And I should have stayed away. But I didn't, and the forest knew I wouldn't. I didn't go looking for the cave. I need that to be clear. Most people think rangers stumble into danger because they're curious or reckless or driven by some heroic instinct to uncover the unknown. But that's not what happened. If anything, I avoided Deadwater Ridge the way you avoid a memory you're not ready to face. The locals had told me enough to keep me away. Stories about animals that went in but never came out, strange nocturnal sounds under the ground, and a cave that seemed to shift its entrance after storms as though the land itself was breathing. But some places don't wait for you to come to them. They pull you in. The first step toward the cave began with a missing trapper. His name isn't important. What matters is that he'd been out checking snares along the ridge and hadn't returned by nightfall. The man was experienced, decades in the timber, the kind of person who could track a cougar in the dark by scent alone. He wasn't someone who got lost. Not in these woods. When dispatch notified me, it was near midnight. The air outside had a strange heaviness to it, damp but without rain, cold but without frost. It was the kind of air the locals say the pines exhale when something old wakes beneath the soil. I geared up and headed out alone. The trail leading toward Deadwater Ridge is narrow, sloped, and broken in a way that suggests it doesn't want to be walked. The ground feels uneven not because of erosion, but because it feels stepped on from below, like something pressed upward long ago and froze in place. By the time I reached the first rise, the forest had gone silent, not the peaceful silence of snowfall. This was a listening silence, a silence with intent. My flashlight cut a thin line across the trunks, the beam catching patches of frost that hadn't been there earlier. The temperature was dropping fast, too fast. My breath crystallized the moment it hit the air. I found the trapper's first snare empty, the ground around it disturbed, not by the animal he'd been tracking, but by something heavier. The soil had depressions, wide and deep, spaced too far apart for any known native species. The depressions matched the strange prints from the narrows. I moved on. A quarter-mile farther into the ridge, I found his second snare, torn apart like something had ripped it free without slowing down. The wire was twisted into a shape like a braid. That takes strength, inhuman strength. My pulse tightened. The forest did not feel empty. I called his name. The sound died almost instantly, swallowed by the trees. Something shifted to my right. A branch didn't snap. It bent, like weight pressed down on it just enough to bow it. I turned the beam. Nothing. And then the smell hit. Not rot, exactly. Something wetter. Older, like the inside of a cave where bones have been soaking for 100 winters. The air thickened around me. The listening silence grew tighter as if the forest had taken a breath and held it. Then I saw it. At the base of a long, sloping hill, half hidden behind a curtain of low brush, was a dark opening. Rough-hewn stone ringed the entrance, and the earth around it had collapsed inward as though the land itself had been pulled down into a hollow space. I'd never noticed the opening before, and I'd walked this route dozens of times. The cave looked new or newly exposed, and the trapper's tracks led straight toward it. Every instinct told me to stay back. The forest around the entrance felt different, like the trees pulled away slightly, leaning outward instead of inward, refusing to be near it. Even the air smelled wrong, cold metal, wet mineral, something else underneath that made my skin crawl. But leaving him wasn't an option. I switched my flashlight to its highest setting and stepped inside. The temperature plummeted. Ice traced the walls in thin filaments like veins beneath translucent skin. The cave wasn't deep, not at first. The corridor sloped downward gently, the floor uneven, slick in patches. The dripping sound echoed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, too steady to be natural. About 30 feet in, I found the first sign of him. One of his gloves. Torn. As if something had pulled it straight off his hand. I crouched, running my fingers across the tear pattern. The edges were frayed, stretched, not bitten. Something with hands, large ones, had ripped it. My stomach tightened. I stood, raising the beam. The light fell upon markings on the cave wall. Lines, shapes, symbols scratched deep into the stone, some fresh, some faded. Spiraling patterns, jagged claw-like strokes, silhouettes that looked vaguely human but wrong. Limbs too long, torsos too narrow, heads shaped like elongated shadows. The cave wasn't natural. Something had marked its walls with memory. I moved deeper. The corridor widened into a chamber. My breath caught as I stepped in because the air here was warm, unnaturally so, like someone had been breathing into the space for hours. And at the center of the chamber was the trapper, or what remained of him. He wasn't dead, not exactly. He sat against the far wall, knees drawn up, arms limp at his sides. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His mouth was parted slightly, as though he'd been whispering when it finally left him. "Sir," I said softly, stepping toward him. He didn't respond. His pupils were dilated completely, swallowing the iris. His skin had a pale tint to it, gray-blue, as though something had drained the warmth from his blood. His body didn't show wounds, no signs of struggle, no bites, no scratches. Just emptiness. "Sir," I repeated, kneeling beside him. His lips moved, barely. So softly I thought at first it was a tremor. I leaned closer. What he whispered chilled me deeper than the winter air outside. "They're awake now." I froze. "What's awake?" His eyes shifted. Not toward me, but toward the far wall of the chamber. I turned the beam, and what I thought was shadow began to move. Slowly. Deliberately. A shape peeled itself from the stone as if it had been pressed into it. Tall. Taller than any man. Its limbs long and sinewy, its shoulders broad, but hunched. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was the same color as the rock, blending perfectly with the cave around it. And its eyes reflected the light like wet obsidian. No irises, no whites, just depth. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal. It stood still for a long moment, the air vibrating with a low hum that seemed to pulse from its chest, a sound like distant wind passing through hollow bone. I didn't breathe. The trapper's voice rasped again, barely audible. "Don't look at its face." I didn't understand. He trembled violently. "Don't." The creature stepped forward. One movement, one fluid shift of weight that told me everything I needed to know about its strength. I backed away slowly, lifting the trapper's arm, trying to pull him with me, but he wouldn't move. His body went rigid, breath stuttering. Something unseen held him in place, or something inside him refused to leave. The creature tilted its head, listening, not to me, to the forest above the cave. And in that moment, something shifted in the air, pressure releasing, the cave walls almost sighing. The hum faded. The creature stepped back, into the wall. Its body melted into the stone like water absorbing into earth. Within seconds, it was gone, not vanished, hidden, waiting. The trapper sagged forward, unconscious. I grabbed him under his arms, hauling him up, dragging him toward the corridor. He was heavy, too heavy, but adrenaline drives a person beyond reason. The cave resisted, the air thickening, the darkness tightening like a closing fist. But the creature didn't return. Not then, not until later, and the forest never let me forget that it had let me leave. It had allowed it, because I had seen enough to understand its warning. The cave wasn't a place, it was an opening, a doorway, a breath held beneath the earth, and something on the other side was listening. We made it out of the cave alive, but I didn't feel alive. Not in the way a person should. The snow outside felt too bright, too loud, too sharp against my eyes. The trapper's weight in my arms reminded me more of a body than a man, though I could feel the faint flutter of breath in him, thin and trembling like a candle on the verge of going out. Whatever had hollowed him had left some fragile thread behind. I managed to radio for extraction once I cleared the ridge. My voice shook more than I wanted it to when I gave our coordinates. I remember the dispatcher asking if everything was all right. I said yes. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded small. It sounded borrowed. The med team arrived within an hour and took the trapper to a hospital 2 counties away. The closer one refused him the moment they saw his condition. I followed, partly out of duty, partly out of something heavier, something lodged beneath my ribs that I couldn't name. But when the doctors examined him, Their words made less sense than the forest. They said he had no injuries, no signs of hypothermia, no trauma, and yet he remained unresponsive, his body limp, his eyes open in the same distant, hollow stare. They called it catatonia. They called it psychological shock. They didn't call it what it was. Fear shaped into something physical, something that stayed with him long after the cave released him. I sat by his hospital bed for hours, listening to the machines tick and hum. His breathing stayed shallow, steady, like the forest had trained him to breathe differently, like he was still listening for something I couldn't hear. At one point, just before dawn, he stirred. His fingers twitched. His lips trembled. I stood immediately. His eyes shifted, not to me, but toward the far corner of the room. He whispered something so faint I barely caught it. It followed. My blood froze. I stepped closer. What followed? But he didn't answer. His breathing slowed until it evened out again, his body sinking back into that fragile stillness. I turned toward the corner, half expecting to see the shape from the cave pressed against the wall like a shadow waiting for breath. Nothing was there. But the air felt wrong. It had the same heaviness, the same tension, the same scent of cold stone. I left the room, not out of fear, out of survival. The weeks that followed didn't make sense, but the forest rarely cares about sense. Strange calls started coming into dispatch, reports from loggers, hikers, campers, each one stranger than the last. People heard knocking on their cabins at night. Others saw tall shadows moving between the trees at dawn. A group of hikers found claw marks in stone, deep enough to hold a hand inside them. But what unsettled me the most were the ones who said they felt something watching them. Not just eyes, a presence, a weight, like the forest was leaning in close, waiting for them to break. I should have stepped back, should have taken leave, should have listened to the tightening in my chest that whispered, something's changing. Instead, I did the opposite. I pushed deeper into the timber. Night after night, I patrolled the ridge, searching for signs of the creature, not out of heroic instinct, but because something inside me needed answers. Needed to believe the forest could still be understood if I looked long enough. But the truth was growing too fast for me to catch. The first real sign came during a patrol just past midnight, snow falling in fine silver threads that blurred the edges of the trees. I walked the perimeter near North Ridge Station, the same one where I'd first heard the deep, deliberate breathing years ago. The snow muffled everything, and the world felt small and compressed, like I was walking through a pocket of held breath. I paused to clear ice from a trail sign when I heard footsteps. Not behind me, above me. Slow, heavy steps pressing down on branches overhead. Whatever made them had weight, but it moved with impossible control, quiet enough that I only heard the flecks of wood beneath it. I tilted my flashlight up. The beam caught snow drifting from the branches, nothing else. But the sound persisted, steady, pacing. Then it stopped. The silence folded in on itself. A low exhale drifted down, warm, moist, heavy. It brushed the back of my neck. I froze. A drop of condensation slid along my collar. Something was breathing directly above me. I forced myself to raise the flashlight. The branch was empty. The sound had no source. The breath had no body. But the snow beneath my boots, untouched moments before, now held two immense depressions beside mine. Fresh, deep, melting slightly from the warmth of whatever had been standing there. The forest wasn't trying to hide it anymore. It wasn't teasing. It was revealing. The next night, I found the markings. They weren't on stone this time. They were carved into the bark of old-growth pines, the oldest trees in the forest, the ones locals whispered about in the way people talk about elders who know more than they say. Long, jagged claw lines spiraled across 3 trees in a perfect triangle, each one facing inward toward a central point on the ground. I stepped inside the triangle, expecting to feel something, a shift, a breath, a chill. Instead, I felt heat. A pulse beneath the soil, faint but real. Something was moving underneath, not burrowing, not crawling, pushing upward. I backed away, breath shaking. The forest wasn't just alive, it was waking. I spent hours trying to explain it away. Deep root fungal networks, geothermal activity, seismic shifts, anything with a rational frame. But every explanation collapsed under its own weight because the truth was far simpler and far more horrifying. The creature from the cave wasn't alone. And the forest wasn't a victim of whatever lived beneath it. It was a partner, a living system working together with whatever ancient thing had carved symbols into stone, a system I was no longer an observer of. I had become part of it. That realization sat with me for days, lodged deep like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I slept badly, ate little, my senses sharpened unnaturally. The smallest noises made me flinch. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't have. The scent of wet earth followed me even indoors. Then one night, not far from where I'd found the triangle of clawed trees, I heard something I've never forgotten. A cry. Human. Human. Desperate. Cut short. I ran toward it without thinking, cutting through saplings and brush, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly over the snow. The sound had come from a ravine, a steep drop-off carved by centuries of water and winter. When I reached the edge, my breath caught. 2 sets of prints led directly to the cliff, boot prints and those deeper, monstrous depressions. Only one set stopped. The boot prints ended at the edge. The larger prints didn't. They walked parallel to the cliff and then vanished into thin air. Something had walked along the ravine wall. Something big, something comfortable moving where humans couldn't. I leaned over the edge, sweeping the light downward. The beam landed on a shape halfway down. Not a body. A carving. A massive humanoid outline etched into the stone, its proportions matching the creature from the cave. Its head turned upward, its eyes carved as deep, dark hollows. Snow gathered in its cracks, making it look like it had been staring up at the sky for centuries. But it hadn't been there the week before. The forest was leaving messages, and I was the intended reader. That night, I knew the truth I'd been avoiding. The creature hadn't let me go out of mercy. It let me go because I was part of the story now, part of whatever had been living beneath Deadwater Ridge long before I was born, part of whatever was awakening. The fear wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet, heavy, patient. The kind of fear that knows it doesn't need to chase you because it's already inside you, waiting for the final piece. And the forest wasn't done giving me pieces. Piece by piece, the forest had been drawing me toward something. I knew it long before I admitted it. Every encounter, every sound, every shadow, it wasn't random. It was a path. And the deeper I went, the harder it became to tell where the forest ended and where my fear began. I used to believe that fear came from danger, but out here, danger came from pretending fear wasn't real. The last push began on a night colder than anything I'd felt in all my years on the ridge. The kind of cold that feels personal, like the world is shrinking around you. The wind had died completely, leaving the trees standing rigid and unmoving against the sky. It was the stillness that woke me. Not the cold, not a sound, stillness. A complete absence of movement, as though the world had frozen mid-breath. I stepped outside the cabin and immediately knew something was wrong. No tracks in the snow, no scent of pine, no rustle of branches. Just silence so deep it felt carved from the world itself. Then I saw the lights, not like those drifting blue ones in Elk Valley. These were steady, fixed, 3 points of pale white light shining straight through the tree line, forming a triangle that pulsed with slow, rhythmic precision. My heart thudded painfully because I recognized the pattern without understanding how I knew it. It matched the triangle of clawed trees. The forest wasn't hinting anymore. It was calling. I grabbed my coat, the radio, the flashlight, though some part of me already knew the light wouldn't matter, and started toward the lights. The trees felt different as I passed between them. Taller, straighter, watching without eyes. The snow under my boots barely crunched. Sound had been thinned out again, stretched until it barely held shape. When I reached the clearing, the lights vanished. The trees exhaled, and something stepped into the open. Not the creature from the cave, not exactly. This one was taller, its shape more defined, its limbs thicker, its posture straighter, Its skin reflected the moonlight like wet stone. Its eyes were hollow black wells that swallowed the beam of my flashlight before it reached them. I froze. Breath caught in my throat. It didn't move toward me. It didn't threaten. It simply stood, watching me with that impossible stillness creatures only have when they've never had to fear anything in their lives. The forest around us held its breath again. Everything inside me, instinct, reason, memory, pulled in different directions. I wanted to flee. I wanted to stand my ground. I wanted to scream. Instead, I whispered, barely audible, "What do you want?" The creature tilted its head, a small, almost human gesture. And then, from somewhere behind me, a second shape moved. I spun. Another creature stood at the tree line. This one smaller but no less terrifying. Its eyes glinted with the same bottomless black. A low hum vibrated from its chest, deep and resonant, echoing faintly through the clearing. My pulse hammered as something clicked into place. They weren't hunting. They were gathering. The hum grew louder. The air tightened, vibrating through my bones, my teeth, my jaw. It felt like standing inside a tuning fork. A third voice joined the hum. Then a fourth. Shapes moved between the trees, emerging one by one, all tall, all impossibly still, all watching. 7 in total. I stepped back, breath shallow. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound they'd made. One creature moved forward, not fast, not threatening, just deliberate. Every step, its feet sank into the snow without sound, thus without resistance, like the ground welcomed it. My body wanted to collapse, to kneel, to give in to something older and larger than fear. But I stayed standing, though I felt like a child in the presence of something that existed long before humans had names for the dark. Its chest expanded with a slow inhale, and then it spoke. Not in words, not in any language, in a vibration. A memory pressed directly into my mind. Images flickered, caves older than stone, forests shifting like living skin, massive shapes moving under the surface of the earth like whales beneath water. And one message, more sensation than thought: we were here before you. We will be here after you. You are between. My heart thudded painfully. The forest wasn't haunted. The forest was inhabited. The pines were not whispering stories. They were remembering them, holding them, passing them to whatever creatures lived beneath Deadwater Ridge. Another wave of images hit me. Humans wandering too close and vanishing. Not killed, consumed by something older, absorbed into the memory of the land. The trapper sitting in the cave, emptied but breathing. The footprints that stopped mid-step. The voices that mimicked human tones not out of malice, but out of curiosity. Curiosity about us, about our emotions, about fear. The creature took one final step toward me. It raised a long, stone-colored hand and touched the center of my chest with 2 enormous fingers. Not forcefully, gently. A pressure spread through my ribs, my lungs, my spine, warm, cold, alive, not alive. Images surged again, faster this time, too fast to understand. 1,000 winters, 1,000 wake-ups beneath the soil, 1,000 watchers in the dark. And then, suddenly, the pressure stopped. The hand lowered, the creatures stepped back one by one, fading into the tree line, melting into shadow, into bark, into the dark places between roots. The clearing emptied. Silence returned, real silence. But I didn't move, because the weight they'd pressed into me didn't fade. It stayed. A pulse, a rhythm, a whisper beneath the sternum, a reminder. When I finally walked back to the cabin, I walked differently. Not injured, not afraid in the same way. More like I was carrying something that didn't belong entirely to me. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the next. Because the truth had settled deeply into me. I wasn't simply a ranger anymore. I was a witness, a keeper of something the forest had chosen not to hide from me. And that kind of knowing doesn't let you go back to life as it was. It changes how you walk the timber, how you listen to the wind, how you look at caves and ravines and claw marks on trees. But the worst part, the part that follows me like a long shadow, isn't what I saw. It's what I feel now, in the quiet. Sometimes, when the pines sway just enough to let the air whisper between them, I feel the hum rise in my chest, low, steady, familiar. A vibration I didn't have before that night, a vibration that answers something calling beneath the earth. I patrol these woods with the same badge, the same uniform, the same job, but I am not the same man. Locals still whisper about the spirits of the pines. They say the forest remembers every story, every person, every disappearance. They speak of creatures that move in the dark like stone come to life and caves that breathe with ancient lungs. But they don't know what I know. They don't feel what I feel. The forest doesn't haunt people. It chooses them. And once it chooses you, it never lets you walk away unmarked. I am its witness, its memory, its messenger. And long after my voice fades, long after my footprints vanish into snow and soil, long after every path I've walked grows over with moss, the forest will still whisper, because some stories are not written. They are kept in the roots, in the stone, in the pines, and I am one of them now.